Because, let's face it, as you said, the genocide has been financed and armed by Biden, by the Democrats, by the German government, by the French government, by the Italian government, by the European Union. The liberal establishment is primarily responsible for the genocide of the Palestinians. Have been for yonks now, right? They wax lyrical about the two-state solution. If you push them about their complicity to the genocide, that is the liberals, the centrists, they say, yeah, but we support the two-state solution. Well, this is simply something they say in order to cover up for their complicity in the genocide. Because they are arming the man who has spent his whole life, that is Netanyahu, destroying any possibility of a two-state solution. And while arming him to destroy the possibility of a two-state solution, the liberal centrists in the United States and the European Union have been proclaiming the two-state solution, right? Between you and I hope this is not taken out of context, I prefer Trump. Because Trump says, okay, now what is the logic of arming Netanyahu? That he's going to kill every Palestinian there is, or expel them, the ones who have survived and haven't died of bullet wounds or drone attacks or starvation or thirst, right? So what happens then? We have a big empty land in Gaza. Okay, I'm going to take it over and I'm going to build my Trump land there. And I am going to celebrate this with my friend Netanyahu. He's far more honest and logically coherent than all these supposedly nice, sweet centrists who've been talking about a two-state solution, but have been complicit in the total annihilation of any chance of a two-state solution.
I mean, a lot of reason why, we're probably having this discussion. We probably would have spoken to you because, you're a very well-known person anyway. But a lot of the discussions you have had and the discussions we've had as a news organization and others, we're having these discussions to a large extent because of October 7th, irrespective of Trump coming into power, etc. Right? And yes, as you mentioned in your first answer about the colonial legacy, and even now the fact that there's been this liberal mask, a mask of all Western powers have kind of existed on Palestine for 75 years. So it wasn't shocking that post-October 7th, Israel's brutality was going to be quite obvious, going to be quite overt, and that they'd be given rope by Western powers to sort of do what they were going to do. But even so, are you surprised by the extent of the destruction, by the response, by the crackdown on civil liberties in Western countries as a result? Like, even though you kind of knew and expected there'll be atrocities that are now going to be committed, are you still surprised by the extent and the level of those atrocities?
No, I'm not at all surprised. It is utterly consistent with everything that has been happening in Palestine since the Nakba, since 1948. The doctrine of the Israeli apartheid state has been consistent. We will kill 100 people for every one of our soldiers or settlers who is impeded from carrying out the ethnic cleansing. They've been remarkably stable in this in this pursuit. If I am surprised by something, I have to say, and that's because of my naivete. It was, for instance, when in April of 2024, the German authorities banned me from entering Germany, even by Zoom, even by the medium that you and I are using today to discuss. I have to tell you that I never expected them to be so blatant in the ease with which they were destroying the very concept of the rule of law in Europe. I was expecting them to be more careful when it came to jeopardizing the facade of a Europe that is rules-bound. Banning a citizen of the European Union from traveling to Germany because he doesn't support the genocide of Palestinians, and banning him too electronically. I have to tell you that this was beyond the limits of my imagination. It more or less entertained me because I realized that they must be particularly stressed by the subconscious. There must be only a subconscious guilt over their complicity to the genocide. They simply are in denial. So they like toddlers, like toddlers throwing a tantrum. Our European leaders are behaving with such wanton disrespect to the rules which supposedly ought to govern their behavior, which they have waxed lyrical about, for decades now. That, I have to say, surprised me to some extent. 2008 was our generation's 1929. Capitalism had two moments when it nearly faced extinction. 1929 was one of them, 2008 was the other one. 1929 was overcome in the end through the Second World War, which revived capital accumulation in the capitalist West. It shifted from Britain to the United States, and through this tectonic shift, it revived itself for another 80 years or so, 70 years. In order to continue to be hegemonic, American-based capitalism did something remarkable in the 1970s. Essentially, if you think about it, the British Empire collapsed because eventually, once it became a deficit economy, and after it stopped being able to finance its deficits through India and through Malaysia, through the plunder of Asia, at some point collapsed. But this is absolutely a defining point about our era. The United States, after the late 1960s, when it too became a deficit economy, it managed to do something that had never been done by any empire in the past. Not the British Empire, not the Dutch Empire, not the Spanish Empire, not the Roman Empire. It rebuilt and grew its hegemony by becoming a very bankrupt country, by going deeper into the red, and by making the rest of the world's capitalists effectively pay for its deficits, because this is exactly what's been happening since the 1970s. So you have a new model of hegemony where strength grows not on surpluses, but on deficits. Because of the power of the dollar, the Americans use their trade deficit, the American ruling class, not the people of America, who suffered just as much as the rest of the world from this transformation of the United States into a deficit country. The American trade deficit, which Trump talks about now as something that he needs to shrink, but nevertheless, the American trade deficit, by growing, it operated like a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into the United States the net exports of Germany, of Japan, of Southeast Asia, and later of China. And who was paying for this deficit? Well, the capitalists from these countries, France, Germany, Japan, China, Korea, and so on, they sent their dollars that they were making from the United States market, because of the US trade deficit they were making, they were sending it back to the United States to finance the American state, the American army, American finance, and American real estate. So between the 1970s and 2008, that was the model of American hegemony. That was the globalization. What people refer to as globalization, that's what it was. It was the American ruling class turning itself into a rentier class, using its trade deficit to keep the rest of the world's capitalists going, while the rest of the world's capitalists sending their loot back to New York. Okay? On the back of this tsunami of money that was going back to New York, the Wall Street bankers built up these humongous derivatives, those toxic financial products that Warren Buffett once described as weapons of mass financial destruction. And those exploded in 2008. And the whole thing nearly died. American capitalism and global capitalism was saved by two forces, or two institutions if you want. China, that upped the ante, that increased production and invested massively to prop up the global system, and by the Federal Reserve, the central banks, Bank of America and all the other European central banks and the Central Bank of Japan, that minted $35 trillion in order to save capitalism. But, when you combine this huge flow of money, printed money, with austerity for the majority of people in America, in Europe, this combination of austerity and huge quantities of money, it operates like cortisone to a cancer patient. It makes you feel, the patient feels more uppity, reasonably well, but the cancer is doing its nasty business underneath the skin. And after 15 years of this, since 2008, with Obama and the Democrats totally betraying the people that entrusted them, that voted them in. Essentially, that was the reason why Trumpism was created. And therefore, this stagnating capitalism after 2008, aided and abetted by the rise of a new form of capital in big tech, which I call cloud capital, capital that lives in the cloud, the proverbial cloud. It's not in the cloud, it's on Earth, and it's in the oceans, optic fiber cables, our iPads and mobile phones and cell towers and algorithms and AI bots and all that. All this has spelled the end of what we knew as capitalism. This is what I said in my last book. We have a new system, in my estimation. I call it techno-feudalism. It's a stage after capitalism. It's far worse than capitalism even. And it is a system which produces political fragmentation. It has fewer capacities to replicate itself than even capitalism had. And therefore, and this was my long-winded answer to your very succinct question, it creates this sensation that the West is finished. But, it's like a wounded dragon. The more wounded it is, the more it thrashes about, and the more dangerous it is for the people living within the West and primarily the people of the global South. I think it's a mistake to focus as much as he does on tariffs, because for his people, his team, and remember, his team is more important than him. In the same way that, the last 50 years, globalization, neoliberalism, all that was a result of another president who shocked the world. That was President Nixon, who in 1971 appended, effectively disintegrated, destroyed the post-world order that the Americans had created. It was actually far more poignant and, if you want, aggressive what he did, what Nixon did. But Nixon was not that much of an intellectual. If you asked him exactly what he was trying to do, he probably would have not been very coherent. But the people around him, Henry Kissinger, John Connolly, his Treasury Secretary, and Paul Volcker, who then later became the chairman of the Fed, they knew exactly what they were doing. And if you read their texts and their speeches and the minutes of their discussions in 1969 and 1970, you could see exactly what they were doing. Why am I saying that? Because we should not emphasize too much Trump. Trump has a team around him. He's a frontman. So there's Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, similarly to John Connolly, who was the Treasury Secretary of Nixon. He's got Stephen Miran behind him. He's got a number of people who know exactly what they're doing. And if you read what they're saying, for them, tariffs are just a tool. They're a means to an end. They're not the essence of it. As far as they're concerned, and I think that Trump also thinks that way, the intention is to bring them down at some point. The project of the Trump team, the purpose and the intention of the Trump shock, which, as I said, is an attempt to revive the Nixon shock of 50 years ago, they are very clear on what they want to do. They want to devalue the dollar while maintaining the dollar's dominance. Now, that sounds like a contradiction, but it is not, because Nixon did that. Nixon devalued the dollar massively in 1971, after the 15th of August 1971, massive devaluation of the dollar. But through devaluing it, he created the circumstances for the dollar to become more hegemonic and more dominant as the world's currency than ever. Now, the Trump team are fearful, they worry, that the dollar may lose its hegemony. And what they want to do is they want to bring its value down in relation to its exchange rate vis-a-vis the pound, the yen, the won, the euro, and so on. They want to bring it down by around 30%, while at the same time forcing those foreigners who have lots of dollars, whether they are central banks or privateers, to sell their dollars, but not to buy the won, the Chinese currency, not to buy the yen, the Japanese currency, not to buy the euro to maintain their hegemony. So is this plan going to work? I don't know. Who knows? If this was a conversation we were having in 1971, would we be able to predict whether the Nixon shock would work? No way. No one can make these predictions. But to dismiss the Trump team as a bunch of Neanderthals, which is what the liberal establishment is doing both in the United States and in Europe. If you read the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, they dismiss them as a bunch of idiots. This is a major error. It's the same error they made in 1971 against Nixon. So if you ask me, will it work? I don't think it will work. But we should take very seriously what their intentions are, and we should differentiate between the means and the ends. The tariffs are not the ends, they're the means. He's putting them up there as a bargaining chip in order to convince different countries to do different things. He doesn't want the rest of us to do the same thing. He wants each one of us to do a different thing. So when it comes to the Japanese, for instance, the Japanese have $1.2 trillion in savings. He wants them to sell them. And he wants them to buy very long-dated, low-interest rate American debt. He wants them to buy crypto, especially Tether, or some stable coin which is linked to the United States dollar, because if they do that, they are selling dollars, the dollar goes down. But what they're doing is they are putting the money into a US dollar-denominated asset, which then is covered by buying, Tether buys 30-year long dated US treasuries. So they have a plan, right? Who doesn't have a plan? Europe, the United Kingdom. They are, politicians that are running around like decapitated chickens, not knowing what's going on. The only people who have a plan are the Chinese. And some other countries, like South Korea and Vietnam, who are far more in tune what is happening. I consider Trump to be a clear and present danger for civilization. But I am aghast when I see liberals, in particular liberal opponents of Trump, dismiss him as a buffoon who doesn't know what he's doing. This is a very dangerous form of complacency. Well, the global south is where I source my hope these days, not Europe, not the United States. Let me be frank on this. I take my hat off to the young people, particularly, but not only young people, to Jewish comrades who went out on the street, who demonstrated for Palestine, who were beaten up by police, who were arrested, who were harassed, who lost their jobs. Many people lost their jobs. I have colleagues of mine in Germany from our party, Merit 25, there, who lost their jobs. I take my hat off to them. And I'm very pleased that there is this pushback. But allow me to be also critical of our own people, myself included. Allow me, in this context, to draw a comparison between the protesters against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and the pro-Palestinian protesters today in the United States and in Europe. Back then, in 1968, 1969, 1970, the anti-Vietnam War movement held this strong belief that if Vietnam frees itself from imperialism, from the United States Army occupation, that will be connected somehow to their own project in the United States, in France, in Germany, in Britain, to liberate their own societies from oppression, from the capitalist yoke, to put it in old-fashioned left-wing terms. There was this hope that the anti-imperialist war, the anti-imperialist campaign, goes hand in hand with their own liberation. Today, that doesn't happen. The great boys and girls, men and women, who demonstrate in the campuses of the United States at a great risk to themselves, as we have seen, especially under Trump, have no hope in their hearts or minds that America will be liberated. Same here in Europe. The good people who demonstrate in Berlin, in Munich, I've been in many of those demonstrations, they are doing it for the Palestinians. This is fantastic, this is brilliant. But you know what? I lament the fact that they do not connect the fight to liberate Palestine with a fight to liberate Munich, with a fight to liberate Brussels, with a fight to liberate the British working class from the yoke of the people who are actually keeping them down, not leaving them behind, but holding them down. And that works both ways. The fact that they don't hope anymore that we can liberate Europe means that our capacity to be helpful to the cause of Palestinian liberation is circumscribed, and vice versa. However, when I see similar movements, similar protesters in South Africa, in Namibia, in Malaysia, in the whole of Latin America, supporting the Palestinian cause, you can still see what used to be the case in the 1960s and early 70s in Europe and in the United States. You can still see that these young people are connecting the Palestinian liberation struggle with their own liberation struggle. And I think that creates the feedback, the positive feedback effect between the local liberation struggle and the Palestinian liberation struggle, which is good both for Palestine and for the global south. It is imperative that we do not place China and Russia in the same basket. They're very different kettles of fish, very different. The collapse of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, which was very painful for people like me, primarily because the working class of the Soviet Union did not rise up to support, to defend a system which supposedly gave predominance to the working class, which means that it never really did give predominance to the working class. And the result was that essentially you had regime change. You had the United States directing the wholesale privatization of the Soviet economy, which meant that within days, it became an ironclad oligarchy. Because when you give pieces of paper, little shares for every corporation there was, that was the Chubais plan, essentially giving tiny little portions of the ownership of the means of production to the people who are starving, who can't put food on the table, they will sell those pieces of paper to the highest bidder. So in the end, 10 oligarchs bought the whole of the former Soviet or Russian economy. And you have effectively an industrial feudalism. An oligarchy that was particularly fascistic in its behavior. You had the rise of Putin, and you had the massacres of the Chechens. You had a society where average life expectancy for men dropped from 77 years to 53. That has never happened even during the Second World War. So that's Russia. China is totally different. There was no regime change in China. Yes, you're completely right. I would suffocate in a regime where I cannot express my views, I cannot criticize the government, I can't criticize the president without fearing that, that will disappear overnight. That, to me, as a radical Democrat, is unacceptable. But at the same time, China is a remarkable experiment in progress. I've been there a number of times, and what I see makes me very optimistic. Not fully optimistic, but compared to other places, I think that it is quite fascinating. On the one hand, you are completely right. You have unacceptable limits on free speech. You have authoritarianism. You have people languishing in prison because of their beliefs. Totally unacceptable stuff. But at the same time, if you go into any municipality in Shanghai, in Shenzhen, in Guangzhou, in Beijing, you enter the municipality building, which, in these huge cities, the building is very large, believe me. And on the first floor, there are all these conference rooms, and you see there boisterous debates happening between citizen assemblies, within citizen assemblies. So there is a absolutely frenetic, boisterous local democracy happening in China, which is unheard of in Europe. And they do write legislation that governs their lives in their municipality. So at the level of the municipality and the region, there is a lot more democracy in China today than there is in Europe or in the United States for that matter. Similarly, in the same sense, you have housing, which is increasingly socialized after 20 years of privatization. You have a big tech sector, which has been placed on a leash by a government determined to minimize the exorbitant powers of the owners of applications and what I call cloud capital. You have, let me give you an example. They did away with private schooling, and now you have a return of a remarkable public schooling system. There are huge clashes. I talk to people in China, and the diversity of opinion is greater than it is in the United States or in Europe. So if you add to that the fact that China, while very large and wanting to be influential, is not an imperialist power. They have not started a single war in the last 40 years, unlike the United States, unlike the Europeans. And they really don't want to do that which the Soviet Communist Party used to want to do, which is to determine who's going to be the president of Afghanistan and who should lead Ethiopia. The Chinese are really not interested in being interventionists at all in that sense. Their relationship with the rest of the global South seems to be a very healthy one and a very open-minded one. Maybe sometimes too open-minded, in the sense that they will not criticize dictatorial regimes because they don't want to be at all interventionist. But what I see with BRICS Pay and the various attempts to create a monetary infrastructure that will give an opportunity to the rest of the global South to transact without going through the Federal Reserve, without being under the thumb of the United States imperialist forces and institutions. This is all a source of encouragement. And I think that the rest of the global South can and should take advantage of the facilities that the Chinese are making available to them. Will you allow me to plug another book of mine, the previous book?
Yes, absolutely.
The only reason I'm mentioning that is because, it took me a decade before I drummed up the courage in my soul to try to answer your question. If you don't like this, mate, what's the alternative? And the result was a science fiction novel, which I called Another Now, in which I tried to imagine how the world could be today, with the technologies that we have, with the failed human psyches that we have. How could it be better today? Very briefly, I think we need three things. We need a lot of things, but in the short space of time I have, we need three things. Firstly, we need to organize production of value along the lines of the principle of a one person, one employee, one share, one vote. The idea that some people own the companies in which we work, and that those who work do not own the companies. This is a preposterous idea that we have to do without. Secondly, we need to collectivize money. We need our monetary systems not to belong to the bankers anymore. Because if you think about it, in every major economy, 97% of the money is not produced by the central bank of the state. It is produced by private bankers. So for this, we need to promote a monetary commons. I've done a lot of work. I've explained this in that book. I've tried to explain it in other fora, how we could have a monetary commons. And thirdly, we need to have public green investment. The market is never going to perform the green transition on its own. Its incentives are all wrong. It can never work. We need to understand that wealth is produced collectively, not individually, and therefore it needs to be directed collectively in the uses which are consistent with the reproduction of our species.
Yanis Varoufakis, thank you so much.